Make sure that it's actually gone live. It says it's live. Okay, hello everyone. I'm Danny Duchamp. Welcome to not my shitty Honda Fit because I don't get that good internet out there. I'm here with Darran Kern. Basically, what we'll be doing today is talking a little bit about transitioning from, I suppose, liberal would be the right word, to towards libertarian. I don't know if Darran, you'd call yourself libertarian yet exactly, but
well, it definitely depends on both words, because there's a lot of liberals I strongly disagree with, and a few things, especially that an ANCAP would be interested in, that I might not necessarily agree with yet, but I'm getting further that way every day. You know, I know a lot more about politics than I did in 2016, and a lot more then than I did a couple years before that, and so forth.
Yeah, so there's definitely there's a lot of play with the words, but basically the concept that I've got here, if this all goes well, is that I want to see how people sort of move towards liberty. Basically, you know, small government sort of people, how they get to that point. I want to get on a conservative at some point, an alt-righter, communist, but I thought sort of classical.
Good luck with the commie.
Yeah, that one's really hard to find.
In libertarian lingo, I believe I'm a minarchist. I do believe that there's a minimal amount of government that has to be around, and there's certain things I'd probably disagree with your average libertarian about what a government should force people to do. But the more I learn about politics, and the more especially that I deal with progressives, or what some people call the regressive left, I'm very much just that classic don't tread on me. It's just like, if there's no reason for you to be telling me what to do, you need to fucking stop doing it.
Yeah,
is basically where I am.
Right, that's basically the journey that I sort of went through. I started off as kind of, I guess, your social liberal sort. I would have been like, oh, well, you know, people should sort of keep to themselves, but we need to have X, Y, and Z social programs, etc. And I started transitioning away from that towards smaller and smaller government. And that was largely not so much due to a philosophical argument that convinced me about libertarianism, so much as it was economic arguments just showing me that, well, if you want to help people, the government's usually a shitty way to do it. It's just not effective. It's pragmatically, it's just not a good way to do it. I mean, so
I've been exposed to a lot more. Oh yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, okay.
I was going to say, I've been watching more conservatives than I used to. I have a pretty wide range of people I watch that are kind of all over the spectrum, but the more I've watched conservatives, the more I've economically even starting to understand how little I really knew about, you know, again, the government probably not always helping.
Yeah. So just because the intention is for this government program to help doesn't mean it's necessarily going to achieve that. Now that's sort of the road I went down. And basically at this point, I'm very sympathetic to anarcho-capitalism. I think that it's a system that ought to be tried. The economics, the way it works out, means that I think it's more likely to work than not. But my basic goal is just that people should be able to do what they want to do and be left alone to do it. It's essentially what my goal has always been. I just changed my view on how to do it. What I wanted to sort of start with, though, is what positions over like the last few years since we last talked, since you were more of a little bit more left-leaning, what specific positions have actually changed for you?
I definitely have, I think, a slightly, again, economics is still very much my weak spot, but a slightly better understanding about how little taxes help, and honestly, in the long term, or even in the middle term so much, how little a lot of welfare programs actually help people. And
so is that to do with, is that the problems with the welfare programs? Is that more to do with you don't think that it's helping them in the short term, or it's more like it's going to cause social problems? It's like going to cause the breakdowns of social ties between people. Well, what's your reasoning for being against that welfare stuff now?
Well, generally, any kind of social welfare where the government's paying for something you should be expected to pay for yourself, that working is entirely dependent on a person not abusing the service and not using it for longer than they need to. And since I'm also very much sort of pessimistic in terms of like expecting things from others, that I generally think that anybody who can take advantage of something more than likely will. A lot of times a lot of these welfare programs aren't really helping people. They just take advantage of it, and then it's just the cost falls on the taxpayer and doesn't really cause the advancement of the person receiving the service. They just operate continuously underusing the service.
Right. So it's not actually
when they don't need it.
It's not actually getting them some social mobility. It's just sort of creating a dependency.
Yeah, where it's, whether it's section housing or even a lot of times things like food stamps. And I'm also starting to notice that it's very much true, especially if I look at my own past, where I used to be the kind of person who needed help when I grew up. Part of my growing up phase was spent poor. I started out like upper middle class, and then sort of the bottom fell out of an industry thanks to Bill Clinton, and went from, as by being raised by a single parent who went from making quite a bit of money to making almost no money, and then 8-9 years later was able to bounce right back into the middle class once could get another job of that quality. But there was a period of time where I was at food banks and was couch surfing with relatives or family friends and stuff, and I remember that a lot of times the stuff we were taking advantage of were things that were run by private charity, particularly like food banks and stuff, and then very rarely were we taking any government help. And I've used food stamps myself for like a very short period of time, and there's only so much you can take advantage of that, unless I mean it was like $200 a month. So,
I also think that there's I also think that there's an interaction difference on the level of how psychologically people interact with a government service giving them money as compared to a charity. When a charity does it, I think they tend to think, I'm being given money, I should be grateful for this and make good use of this money because it's not something I should just expect. This is something that I've been given because people are generous. When it's government money, it's like, where's my damn money, government? I'm entitled to this. And it's that's not the attitude that someone should have if they're trying to pull themselves out of poverty. That's the attitude someone should have if they feel like they shouldn't be responsible for pulling themselves out of poverty.
Yeah, they tend to act like somebody is actually helping them when they accept help from charity, and if they accept it from the government, they take it as a right.
Exactly. And so so welfare was definitely one thing, right? I'd actually like to add to that I don't necessarily think you need to be pessimistic about people's ability to do the right thing, or you're saying you're pessimistic, you think people will just take advantage of the system. I don't think you need to be pessimistic, because if you set up the system of incentives such that the majority of people are going to be incentivized to do the wrong thing, and even if you think the majority of people, like 70% of people, are good, you're still going to have a giant chunk of people taking advantage of the system.
And I still can see plenty of ways in which that kind of social welfare can help people, but I think it needs to be very constrained in the amount given and their time limits and expectations of, like, if we're helping you this much. And I know so little about how it works that I can't go past the conceptual phase, but I really feel like, to the extent at which I still support certain kinds of things, particularly like unemployment benefits and these kind of things, where it's just the taxpayer handing you a fat check, these should be very restricted. And so I know I can think of so many times where the left wing would throw a fit about, like, oh, hey, you should be drug tested to receive that. Oh, that's horrible. That's invasive. Well, yeah, but also I know a lot of these people that I had been around for a very short period of my life where they very much would take advantage of the system, that they would try to barter away their food stamps, and instead of buying food with them, they'd be going like, let me buy your groceries, you buy me drugs. These kinds of things happen extremely commonly. And I do mean, as far as my limited experience is, it's downright ubiquitous, that a lot of times that's happening.
Really. You should expect that sort of thing, really, because if there are a lot of people in your country and you're leaving that option open, you'd have to be crazy to think no one's going to take advantage of it, right? And
even though I was on a food stamp program where it was like, oh, you can't buy cigarettes with these, the amount of cigarettes I did effectively either through barter or through convincing a retailer to let me do it, the amount of cigarettes I did buy with food stamps, more than you think.
Yeah.
Well, that's supposedly against the rules.
These tubes of plant-based food substance. Yeah, that's what these are. Right. They'll just call there are definitely a lot of stores who are going to help you use your food stamps for whatever. And really, is that the right dynamic you should have with a government anyway, where that's sort of babying you like that, right? Where they're deciding what is good for you to purchase. I largely the reason that I was brought further towards libertarianism was understanding the problems of central planning and socialism, right? If you try to centrally plan an entire society, you will fail. Like the Soviet Union tried it.
Absolutely.
just much. And the reason, though, is because people individually have way more information than any government bureaucrat could ever conceivably have about their specific life. So if you try to get the government to start policing everyone's little decisions, it's not just that that's kind of insulting to those people, but it's also very economically inefficient, right? The government bureaucrat just won't have the information that he needs to.
Oh yeah, and that's a pretty extreme example. I've made some friends who live in Bulgaria, Romania, and the Czech Republic, places where it's not that long ago that communism was the state system, and they're telling me stories about how there would almost always be shortages of something because the government was deciding pretty well in advance what to build and produce, and that the market was not deciding those factors at all. So they'd say, hey, we got this giant surplus of fridges, but everybody wants a television, and then there's no television. Those aren't being built yet. You know, that kind of bullshit was surprisingly common.
Right. Well, there's a reason that, you know, it tends not to be the case that a car company will mine the metal and mold it into the various parts and get the gasoline and everything all into one package. The car company will do one final bit where they buy it from all different places. Like, companies that try to do everything all at once tend not to be that successful, right? There's just too much to manage within one organizational structure. Just building cars.
And no modern successful company does anything that they don't have to do, you know?
Right, exactly. Because if you want to manage a complex system, it's much better to break it up into small parts than it is to try to get one giant central structure that'll somehow manage to be able to control all of it. But
I don't mean to change the subject, because you're hitting on something very interesting that is worth bringing up. Is one of the things that, you know, even liberals, let alone progressives, sort of the difference between a center left and a far left person as far as American lingo. One of the things that is the surprisingly something you unlearn later and later is this general sort of distrust of corporations. Corporations, especially if you're a progressive, you know, a further left person, their hierarchy was very terrifying and predatory and monstrous, evil. You know, corporation is a word like Nazi to these people. And one of the first realizations that was pretty shocking to me when I thought of it, and I went, oh, that makes so much more sense, is corporations are not immoral. Corporations are amoral. Corporations do whatever you let them do in order to do two things: cut costs and maximize profit.
Right.
And that's how the market works. And a lot of times I say, like, to the extent that I want a stricture on a corporation is where, like, if something is, you just can't let them do it, because if you let them do it, they will do it. So there has to be some regulation, but the amount of regulation, the more you look into it, is less than you think should be there. It's kind of just down to don't be throwing shit in the river type stuff.
Right. Well, I mean, so if we were to get into the specifics of that, I'd be remiss if I didn't say that the reason that a company could just throw shit into the river would be because no one owns the river. I think that the issue tends to be the concept of a commons, right? If things are not owned by someone, then no one's responsible for them. Thus people will abuse that thing.
Well,
right? We all need this thing. No one owns it.
Yeah, and the only way I would argue with you is the consequences of, say, throwing shit in the river could be so far-reaching that even if you say, okay, nobody owns the river, or they own the river they're throwing shit in, well, the river doesn't just sit there. Well, yeah, but even so, the river spreads these materials to this places, it goes in the groundwater, and yada yada. And there's a lot of things I think the consequences are so great that you have to have somebody to step in and have a baseline of you can't do this. I'm just very limited in what I think those things are.
Going back throughout history, there used to be systems. I mean, if you go to early America, seeing how you're American, the regulations on corporations tended to be actually lobbied for by those corporations. And the reason is, if you're some company that is, I don't know, you're dumping stuff into the river and it's poisoning someone's crops, that guy can now sue you, because that's not an externality that this company is causing harm somehow and, you know, we need to regulate them. No, this person is assaulting this other person. This company is destroying this other person's property. And so that farmer would sue you. And the corporation would essentially
reason I brought up the river example.
If you want to just let me finish, though, if the corporation has specific regulations that say, well, this is how we have to do business and this is how much we're allowed to release, then they are not in danger. They no longer have to deal with the idea that, okay, if we don't do everything right, we might harm someone's property and then we'll be sued. they follow the regulations. So if anything goes wrong, it's the government's fault for not putting the right regulations in place. That, I think, is the issue.
Yeah, and maybe my solution of just the government says so is not the right way to keep somebody from putting stuff in the river. The only reason why I specifically use something as, say, dumping toxic chemicals in the river is because the consequences are so far-reaching that just expecting a lawsuit type thing to take care of it is it's beyond that. But in a lot of cases, where a place where the government does step in with oppressive regulation, when a single lawsuit absolutely would take care of the problem, and it wouldn't be something as extreme as poisoning groundwater, that's where the government should not be there at all. So that's where I'm right there with you.
So the point that I wanted to sort of get at with this hangout, and potentially the later ones that I do, is what's actually pulling people towards libertarianism. Because there's a few different types of arguments that libertarians make. Which ones that we make actually tend to pull people over. My current suspicion is that it tends to be the more pragmatic arguments than the moral ones. If people just yell taxation is theft and say it's just the government's unethical, it doesn't matter if it helps, it's still just wrong and evil and we should kill it, I don't think that convinces people.
No,
however,
especially not
justified, some people might think it is. Right, well,
taxation theft is like
my point is that
boss level libertarianism, if you ask me.
It's
very difficult to persuade me even now, and it was impossible when we first talked for you to explain to me that there's taxation shouldn't even exist, because I can't even imagine that kind of society.
But it's not just that it's extreme. But it's not just that it's extreme. It's also that it's a moral argument, right? My suspicion is that the pragmatic arguments, the arguments about how we can actually practically achieve certain things, will welfare actually help people, that sort of thing, the economic arguments, those sorts of things. My suspicion is that those are far more convincing than the moral arguments about whether it's ethical for the government to act.
Oh, believe it or not, the moral arguments are still more convincing to most people. I can tell you exactly what started pushing me along this.
Were they to you?
Believe it or not, yes. What started me down this road is seeing people I'm supposed to be aligned with and formerly thought I did until I started learning more. Progressives. I would have thought, hey, on that surface level where the layman with no real understanding of policy sees a progressive, they think, hey, gay people should be allowed to marry. And it's like, hey, yeah, why are we even fucking with them? That doesn't serve any purpose. And then you hear more things like, hey, people should be allowed to do this or dress this way. And hey, we shouldn't fuck with people for their personal beliefs. I'm like, yeah, all right. And then what started immediately me seeing something was wrong was, as the progressives got more power and more control, immediately their idea of what to do with that was to, in so many words, fuck with people. Oh, more and more they were saying, you can't buy this, you can't say this, you can't think this, you can't write this, and if you do, we will hurt you, we will punish you, and they will rush straight to the easiest thing to do it with, which is the state.
The state.
Every chance they get, they will use the state as a weapon. And so obviously more and more as this is going on, and my focus being almost exclusively on, hey, progressives are the devil, as far as I'm concerned. They're the worst thing that's ever happened in this country, because all they're doing is telling people, you can't for no good reason. You can't for no good reason. And if you do, we will punish you. And the first thing they try to use is the most effective weapon, the state. And every chance they get, they would use the state.
Well, that's actually not surprising in that case, because it seems to me, just based on what I've talked to you about so far, that let's call you a liberal, your previous position, at least. Let's call that the liberal position.
Sure.
We can debate about whether that's actually the applicable term, but just for the sake of argument, it seems that the best response to that position as a libertarian would be to appeal to the personal freedom thing, because a lot of the left, in some situations, will speak the language of personal freedom, but quickly gives up on it. Right? They'll speak the language of personal freedom when it's freedom to do the things that they think you should be doing, and then very quickly they'll drop it all. So it seems like, so basically, your whole transition to libertarianism was changing your position on who you thought was actually in defense of personal freedom.
Oh, yes. I've always been so much better at not only communicating, but just sort of conceptualizing, not like what's best for everybody, because I know a little bit about a lot rather than a lot about any particular thing. And but I was always seeing like who is obviously a clear and present danger. And I started to realize, like, what do I really care about? Well, I care about my rights. And I care about every right that everybody should have, even if they're not my personal interest, that I can see no harm in. So even though I don't give a shit about guns, I am entirely unconvinced by all these anti-Second Amendment arguments that I run into. And the more and more I dealt with that issue, the more and more I went, well, I see it this quote-unquote gun nuts way. Everything they say makes sense, and everything that who's arguing against them. Because if you think about it like, well, what are you trying to do? Well, stop mass shootings. Okay, well, what's causing mass shootings? As far as I can tell, crazy people who aren't getting the help they need. Right. So I'm like, okay. And I can see a lot of reasons why, especially as a person, I don't like to fucking share this shit, and I don't care, no one in sympathy for anybody, but I was diagnosed bipolar, not the kind who sees and hears shit that isn't there, but the person who's has mood swings. And I know that, thankfully none of the medication I have is exorbitantly expensive, but the kind of shit for schizophrenia, the people who do hear and see things, people with violent ideations and shit, a lot of their medication is very expensive, and it's unreasonably expensive. I go like, okay, but not only that, it's like there used to be all these places like, sanitariums where you could, where people should end up if they can't function in society. And this is some kind of anti-libertarian shit for a lot of people I know. But there are some people who are just too dangerous to be left to their own devices. And I think there should be an extreme amount of burden of proof to prove that somebody's like that. But then if somebody's like that, they shouldn't be walking around in the streets. They shouldn't be in public schools. There's all this kind of stuff. And I've seen these kind of very violent people, very dangerous people. And I think, well, to my best estimation, which is in no expert opinion whatsoever, that's how you help these people. These people say, well, we should just take guns away from everybody because God forbid one of these lunatics gets the gun. And I'm going like, well, you take a look at China. This has happened in a lot of places in Europe. There's mass stabbings. Basically, if a lunatic wants to kill, they will kill with what's available. And yes, some people will say, well, the gun is the most effective weapon. Not necessarily. There were, a small group of lunatics in China, I think back in 2007 or 2009, killed 30 people and injured 120 in a train station just with knives. London has way more murders than some of the largest city and most dangerous cities in America in a populace not allowed to have guns. And most of these murders are performed with blunt weapons and knives. And so it's just like, that's not the solution. And for the most part, there is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of guns in the hands of hundreds of millions of law-abiding citizens in this country who aren't out killing people. I see no reason to fuck with them. And their idea is fuck with everybody because of these extreme examples. Very extreme examples.
In New Zealand, makes no sense. In New Zealand, we started having a lot of restrictions on the sales of fireworks. Based around one incident where two kids stuck fireworks into a dog's ears and killed the dog. Well, that's
horrible, but that has nothing. Terrible, but that in no way stops
another way to talk to the dog.
Fireworks. The only reason I can think of to put any kind of strictures on fireworks is if it's going to burn the whole state down. I grew up in very dry, arid climates in Colorado where there's a lot of forest land, where just about anything can start a huge fire that destroys tons of property, and therefore I can understand why, I now live in Florida where you can have just about every kind of firework you want, and in Colorado growing up, you couldn't have hardly anything, and I understood why you couldn't have it in Colorado.
So a couple of things. First of all, I just wanted to throw out the chat on the. I've got the chat on the side, you guys. I am seeing everything you're saying. A lot of it's a little bit off topic with what we were talking about, though. That's the only reason I haven't responded to it to a great extent. But the other thing is the gun argument, because I find that that's a really strong position for libertarians and conservatives as well.
Very.
Stephen Crowder, actually, who not a giant fan of Stephen Crowder here, but I agree with him on some things, disagree with him on others.
Same.
But he was talking about the various issues that he tends to get a lot of pushback on, and he finds that the gun issue is a really winning issue, at least at the moment online. So what is it about the gun issue that makes the libertarian position of people should be, with every given thing, there seems to be a lot of every given thing that people want to ban, every kind of regulation people want to put in place, every kind of restriction that people want to put in place. There seems to be a lot of pushback when people say, hey, maybe the government isn't the best entity to fix this problem.
Well,
like
a lot of
libertarians
people really.
But what about guns makes them, just to finish the question, what about guns is it, do you think, that makes it so easy for people to say, yeah, actually the government restricting that seems messed up?
Well, it's sort of a mix of superficial and high quality reasons. Like I said, the reason why I'm convinced when I don't really care about guns, I'm not culturally or traditionally interested in guns, is because if you're trying to solve what the people against the guns are trying to solve is shootings and whatever, and they think that removing the guns from people's hands will solve the problem, they are wrong. Just stop right there. If that's your idea, the reason why you want to take them is to cause this solution, that solution will not happen. So you're doing it for no good reason. Right. I'm a pragmatist. If you think the consequence of taking away everybody's guns is you'll stop murder, it's not going to happen.
To be honest, I think a significant thing in that case is probably the terrorism in Europe, because I think when people see a lot of news coming out of Europe about them having to restrict knives and how trucks are just mowing people down left and right, and I think that makes anyone trying to make an anti-gun argument, as they often do in the United States, and as they do a little bit here in New Zealand, we have better gun rights than at least our neighbors. But when the anti-gun people start saying, oh yeah, look, all this murders is because of the guns, people just look overseas and say, things don't seem to be a perfect paradise with no one getting killed over in Europe. I think people are lying.
Ban assault trucks. They're talking about blunting the knives in the freaking authoritarian shithole of the UK.
There's actually some talk about this.
You have to be the age that you have to be in America to buy alcohol is the age you have to buy cutlery in the United Kingdom. Forks.
I've seen very recently from the UK the spoons. See, dessert spoons are tapered a bit at the end, so you could stab someone with that. So all the spoons should be rounded.
They have the kind of rules against so-called weaponry in the United Kingdom as a country that we have in our federal high fucking danger penitentiaries, our prisons. We're like, you're that implement is too sharp, mate. You got a license for that. These fucking.
Well, there's always that. There's that old quote about the progressive paradise, a place where food is provided for you, lodging is provided for you, weapons are banned, and the only people who are allowed to have weapons are the government officials. It's called prison.
Yeah. The United Kingdom is, as far as I'm concerned, it's a fascist shithole, dude. It's what it is.
It's fucking died in a hole. It's actually amazing that they fell that far. It really gave me a little bit of respect for the American ideas of A, the right to bear arms, because your government should be fucking afraid of you, and B, the Constitution, because there should be, if you're going to have a government, which, but if you're going to, there shouldn't just be laws policing what the people can do. There should be laws that police what the government can do, what laws that police the laws the government can pass, which is what I see the Constitution as. Yeah. Right? It doesn't, there's nothing in the Constitution restricting you. All it does is restrict the government. And most countries don't have that. We don't have that here. We're lucky to have a lot of freedom in New Zealand. But recently, not that long ago, we elected basically a communist. And we might see that disappear in a flash because there's just no structures holding the government back like you have in the United States. Yeah. Oh, you seem to have been muted there.
Oh, Darran. Whoops. I said, yeah, sorry. I did because if I'm going to make a noise over here, I always try to mute so I'm not making a ton of noise. But I was going to say, you're going to start looking like your next door neighbor, Australia, here in a minute. It's probably scary.
That would be worrying. Yeah, so they do have the, I don't know, they have restrictive gun laws, but I used to think Australia was the worst.
There's a lot
now looking at the United Kingdom,
progressive stuff they're doing. And the progressives are all about telling you what you can't do, which is, I think libertarians should be right there in the meme crusade with any kind of edgy person or whatever. It doesn't matter. Because, the reason why I'm so focused on the progressives is because it does not take a lot of expertise and it does not take a lot of knowledge or a lot of intelligence to explain why that the progressives are like the worst thing happening to the West right now, because everything they are doing is telling you you can't for no good reason, and a lot of what they want to do it for is to hurt you. You know, a lot of these people are very clearly racist and sexist. You know, they have the same kind of ideas as the communists of the early, you know, 19th and the 19th and 20th century. Only they're not necessarily concerned with just class. They care about, you know, what's between your legs. You care about who you sleep with. You care about what you think, how you act, how you speak, where you're from, what color your skin is. And they will hurt you based on these very superficial facts, let alone on anything actually of any consequence.
Right. It's the descendants of the Frankfurt School who realized that, hey, communism didn't work when it was just about class. Let's see how to fix it. Turns out you can't fix
Marxism breaks for
we ended up with now.
Yeah, whether it's whatever you call it, social justice warriors, feminists, postmodernists, social Marxists, Marxist communists, whatever, they're all the same thing, where they produce an us versus them dynamic. They're usually not telling the truth about who the us versus them is and any of this shit, and their entire goal is to unreasonably promote the us at the most extreme expense of the them as they can think of. So it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether it's race or gender or class or anything. They have a vicious dehumanization of the other, and they will wield everything, especially the state, to fuck with those people. Like I said, that's the reason why I'm so much more cognizant of libertarianism.
Well, I think that basically to my initial question, I've got a pretty good answer. The way that you appeal to liberals and try to convince them to come over to libertarianism is individual freedom, right? They care about they care about a person, just some average guy being able to do what he wants to do, and no one coming and fucking with him. Is essentially,
and 99 times out of 100, maybe 999 times out of 1,000, freedom is worth the consequences. And oftentimes, the people trying to take away your freedom, the consequences are way in excess of what's tolerable.
If we've got an answer to the basic question, I think the chat wants to have a word with us here. Like, there's a couple of people saying that we should be reading the chat, so I think we should give that to them.
Yeah, have you got the chat up there? I'll answer any question they want.
Okay, you guys. So if you've got any questions for our libertarian-leaning liberal here, is that right? I don't even know what to call you. You don't know what to call you.
Well, yeah, I think I officially count as I guess something like a minarchist liberal. I just might not necessarily yet have the right interpretation of what is the least amount of government that's right. I might think the least amount of government that's right is more than a lot of libertarians. Might be less than a few. I don't know. But more and more I'm thinking, if I'm not convinced that the government should have the power and to be able to wield consequences at you, then I don't think they should have it. And they should not have it.
Okay, yeah. I can see where you're coming from. So you'd probably be considered a libertarian by most standards. I mean, frankly, you're more libertarian than your country's Libertarian Party. Holy shit, that has gone.
Yeah, I did vote for Gary Johnson, if only because I went like, this is the least of four evils. I got like this new age lunatic, Jill Stein, and I didn't know enough about Trump to like him. I like him a lot more now than I did during the election, and Hillary Clinton was absolutely unthinkable. So, I voted for Gary Johnson, who by most libertarian standards was a garbage libertarian candidate. I mean, I'm aware of that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can understand why you'd vote for Gary Johnson. I don't think that there was a really good option politically in that race.
It was almost like a protest vote. I didn't want to support the binary system.
Personally, I would have suggested voting for Trump just because of the cultural impact, just because all the right people hate him. I don't think there was a good option.
I will in 2020. I will. as far as right now, I will be voting for Trump.
Yeah, well, I can understand why. And to be fair, in office, he seems to have done okay in several things. Right.
A lot of people are terrified of him merely because he has the label of right wing. Don't seem to understand that he was a Democrat supporter his entire life. He's a lot of times what they call a blue dog Democrat, which is for the United States somewhat right wing economically, but rather liberal in a lot of other ways. He doesn't. Right. He's one conservative who, despite throwing some bones to our religious zealot right wing, a lot of our right wing is very religiously zealous here in America. Very, very, very focused on, one of the reasons why I used to be anti-right wing is because the right wing used to be very fundamentalist Christian, and a lot of what they wanted to do was to fuck with you based on their religion. Like, there's a lot of places here in America where what I'm holding my hand right here, just weak as piss beer. You can't buy this on Sundays. You can't buy this in city limits. I know of a place in Texas where I used to live. I used to live in Texas, way out in West Texas.
Yeah.
Oh, what is that?
Oh, I got a bit of weird static there, didn't I?
It's gone now. Is it good? Are we good? Well, what I was saying, Texas is a very religious state. There was not a whole lot of towns or cities. There was a lot of empty space where nothing was really out there but fields. And most of these cities, you could not buy alcohol of any kind in their city limits. Now, what happened was, kind of in the middle of nowhere along this highway, this man decided he wanted to build a liquor store. And he decided the way he was going to do this was they were going to basically build almost like a shanty town of a trailer park, essentially, around, and they were going to incorporate as a town, as an actual city of the state of Texas. And they decided to vote as a town that alcohol was legal in their town. And they basically built a small town just around this liquor store. And the owner of that liquor store is a multimillionaire, a very wealthy man. Because he was about the only source of hard liquor, let alone beer, for dozens and dozens of square miles. So, I mean,
it's the end of,
there's no reason for that. And in fact, the fact that people who are alcoholics had to travel so far to obtain alcohol resulted in a lot of drunk driving fatalities. So this was an unpragmatic solution and a useless law for no reason, which is the reason why a lot of the left here hates religious people, because they made a lot of laws like that.
Well, we've got it. So in the chat, we've now got racked up a few questions here. I'm going to... Okay, so I'll start with this one here from Charlie Walters. In the short run, during anarchistic paradigm shift, do you think the gays would be the Ubermensch? Well, actually, there is a pretty decent argument for gays and asexuals and other just non-conforming guys being sort of the Ubermensch. Like, think of the great scientist of history, Alan Turing, fucking faggot. Sir Isaac Newton, he refused, on his deathbed, Sir Isaac Newton actually said that his greatest achievement in life was his lifelong celibacy. After all the scientific advancement, that was it.
A lot of very, very intelligent people who produced very, very big advancements were very, very mentally ill.
Right.
And so a lot of them were very
mentally ill and gay is the same thing. Interesting thing there, Darren.
Now it's the Seinfeld argument. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but factually, being gay is an aberration. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Not that I think it has any consequence on anybody, which is why I don't care.
I can understand. It's cognitive.
Having the same rights as everybody else. Because the reason why we ended up having to strike down the ban on gay marriage is because we have something called the 14th Amendment, which means basically, in so many words, in layman's terms, everybody gets the same rights. So if you say, hey, these people can marry, well, then everybody can marry. And they said, you'll marry dogs and cats and shit. No, it's just people. So I say, hey, gay people, because the government affords you tax breaks and you get different rights, hospital visitation, power of attorney over an incapacitated spouse, all kinds of legal consequences come from being married. And to deny gay couples that, all these governmental given rights.
I understand the argument that it's unconstitutional because it's unequal. I understand the arguments. I personally am.
No, I don't think
I personally just to hold you up there, Darren. I'm personally when I defended the people who voted against gay marriage in Australia, right? I think that the people who voted against it were in the right, and the reason is not because I'm against gays going off and being gay and getting married. The reason is because a tactical thing. I don't want libertarians to meet the other side at where they want, right? The left will say, hey, you guys believe in individual freedom. Well, you know, I know that you guys don't want the marriage to be controlled by government in the first place, but if the straights have it, then why not the gays? And that's a fair argument, but I don't want either of them to be, I don't want either of them to have government marriage. I don't think that the government should have anything to do with marriage, but government should get out of people's bedrooms. And so I will vote against gay marriage every time it comes up, because if you are a left-wing person and you want to defend gay people, well, you're going to have to come over to my side and oppose all government marriage altogether. Then we'll get equality. Until then, I'm not helping you.
Because I also don't believe that you have to bake a gay wedding cake if you don't want to. I don't believe if you have a church and you say gays or whatever, and you don't want to marry gay people, then you shouldn't have to. Because the thing is, as insofar as in marriage is a governmental institution, to say that gay people can't have the civil union, whatever, that comes with all the rights afforded to married people, that just to the extent where I say, hey, you got to let them have it, because that's where the government is involved. Now, as far as bake the cake, no, fuck you, they don't have to bake the cake. You have to let them marry in your church. No, fuck you, you don't have to let them marry in your church. If your church says no gays, then your church says no gays.
Right, but I think that marriage should
all have the same rights. You have to let the gays have the government part of it. You have to let them have it.
I'd agree with that. That's a preferable solution, but preferable to both of those is there being no government aspect to marriage, right? Why does the government have to deal with my relationships at all? That's an end of the. There's a Doug Stanhope line.
Yes,
there's a line from the comedian Doug Stanhope, and he talks about, like, if marriage, like government marriage, didn't exist, would you invent it? You know, well, this shit's too hot. We can't just keep this between us. We've got to get judges and lawyers involved on this, man.
I know who Doug Stanhope is, and I fucking love him, and he's very much an excellent piece of propaganda making for fucking libertarians, because he's right most of the time, if not all of the time, and he's very much a libertarian dude. Same with guys like Penn
propaganda. He admits that he's doing propaganda with his jokes. He said, "You've just got to." The idea is to try to
all propaganda
every argument.
Wrong.
You've just got to find a way to make an argument that's funny.
If you're right, you should be putting out propaganda, because you should be telling other people that you're right.
Exactly. So we've got a few more questions. There's a couple from a guy in the chat called Soy Wars. One of them is, are you aware that some people have begun arguing capitalism requires some level of force? What's your take on that? I think that's probably more towards me, seeing as how Darran here is not opposed to all government, and I'm not opposed to all force. So I think it would have to be me here.
Sure.
My take on that is that it's kind of true that capitalism does require some force, because there are some people who are going to refuse to respect private property rights. My position, being opposed to the institutionalization of government, is that there are private means by which we can enforce property rights, not that there's no force required to enforce property rights. So those people are basically correct, but I suspect that the people making those arguments are going to go somewhere weird with it. There's one that Darran, you might be, where was it? I believe it was, this one. This is from a guy called Gish Goyam, who I follow on Twitter. He's pretty cool. He said, "What is the least?" Gish Goyam,
like Gish Galloping.
Yeah, exactly.
I assume. Yeah.
What is the least amount of government? I want to throw that at you, Darran, because I think that's 0. So what's the least amount of government?
Well, the least amount of government is 0. Now, I think the least amount of government that can have a productive and successful society full of happy people is more than 0. I can tell you that much.
Right. Okay, but so what are some institutions you think are indispensable? I won't necessarily get into the whole debate about it here. I just want to see where you're sort of at.
Well, at the very least, in terms of like public works, building roads, building infrastructure, I think that's something that taxes do got to go into. I think that one's a pretty easy one.
A company couldn't put cement in a line. That would be crazy.
Oh, they could, but I would generally expect companies to only build the cement that was in their best interest. Because, like I said earlier, companies do what's in their best interest. So there'd be a lot of places with no roads. There'd be a lot of places with no electricity and no phone lines and no cell service.
Why?
I think there would be, because there'd be a lot of places where it was not in anybody's best interest to build those things. And if you want them to be everywhere, well, somebody's got to make them be everywhere.
If it's not in anyone's best interest, then that means no one wants it. If it's in someone's best interest, then
it's in the best interest of people who can make it happen, because there'll be a whole bunch of people who
very expensive
things who can't make it happen.
You got very poor little gated, not gated community. Well, you have gated communities who do pay for their own roads, but you've got very poor little communities who could easily pay for their own roads if they needed them. If you're talking about like the big roads to get to like a shopping mall or something,
yeah, I believe you could pull all this stuff off with no government, but it would,
because they want you to be able to get to their shopping mall.
It would require a societal cohesion that, if it isn't a government, it would still require some sort of mass agreement that would be very difficult to enforce without a government to produce these things in the absence of a government. I believe it's possible. I don't believe it's necessarily feasible.
Okay, well, so like I said, I don't want to get hugely into that. And someone asked if I'm a minarchist. I would consider myself an anarchist because I think that most likely anarchy, in the sense of a government, if we count it as a government, could, like, you could have everything the government provides could be provided by a private firm. Defining private firm as one which does not collect taxes, i.e. if you don't want the thing that they're selling, you don't have to pay for it, does not bar competition, so other firms can compete with them, and does not lay claim to land that they have never been to, interacted with, or purchased, right? Like, the government sort of lays claim to random bits of the wilderness in the middle of the country that no one's ever been to. That's, if you go there and build a house, I think you should own that land. But in any case, I think that those three caveats, what I would consider the defining features of a government, and I think we can organize society without any organizations that use those three defining features. So I'm an anarchist fundamentally, but I am open to the idea that one or more of them may need to be violated. I only want to get to sort of the anarcho-capitalist utopia and Capistan. I only want to get there incrementally, and if it seems like it's going wrong, we should hold back. So
I just feel like once you get to that absolute state, you would have any sort of enterprise that had the ability to perform those sort of minimal aspects of government, be it, defense, law, enforcement of order, even if you don't want to call it law enforcement, because a lot of times laws are something that any kind of anarchist would have a problem with. But a lot of times I think that there is a minimal level of government that will exist no matter what. And even if you have free enterprise providing these sort of services in place of the government, in order to affect these kinds of services, that corporation or entity or amalgamation of people would be acting as a government and exerting some kind of force to make certain things happen. And again, those things just would not happen without amount of force. So if you want to say that government by force, there will always be a minimal level of force that will always be there, and it will never be zero.
I agree that there will be force, don't get me wrong. I just think that the agencies which exert that force could have competition.
Oh, right, yeah,
and that would be fine. Like, you could, like,
and I'm very much more now than ever open to considering what really is that minimal threshold where, okay, there's like an absolute zero of force that will always exist, which is more than zero. And I'm more and more likely to want to know what is that, and it's lower and lower every day than I used to think it was. But I'll never agree with the word anarchy, because there will always be force.
Can I just pause you there, actually, Darren? Because this seems to be playing into a question that a guy in the chat called Captain Pipsqueak is asking. A question for Darran Kern. Do you approach minarchism from the standpoint of a little government is necessary, or government should be limited to what is provably necessary?
The latter, absolutely. The government should always be held to what is minimally necessary, which might be subject to change, and it might be that we were wrong about what minimal is, and change that in the future.
Yeah. Actually, that's a good point. Like, you could conceive of the idea that there are two different hypothetical societies, one of which could support itself with zero government, the other one could support itself with only a little government, the other one needs a shitload of government, right?
All it takes is an outside
society in question depends.
You ever heard of that, the second law of thermodynamics, where everything is entropy in a closed system? So you say, like, okay, if you can close a system, then you can expect the government to fall and fall and fall because there's no need for it. There's no need for it. There's no need for it. All it takes is outside influence. All it takes is somebody to walk in and say, it's a nice spot you got here. It's a shame if somebody would kick over your sandcastle and take all your shit. And if you don't have a government to raise an army, there's no law enforcement, there's no standing militia, well, then those people are fucked. Because I used to think, and I think maybe I could be wrong, I don't know, but what I definitely used to think, and I haven't really thought about it since, is if you have your anarchist utopia, all it takes is one of these Fallout style raider bands with a bunch of guns to come in and say, oh, you guys all get along. That's great. We don't get along with you. We're a unified, very effective fighting force, and we will be taking your shit or killing you or both. And it's just like, well, what does the government do in that point? It circles the wagon, so to speak. And I would expect a society like that who's sitting there in anarchist utopia land to be completely without defense against an organized fighting force.
So, I mean, I'm just thinking about to what extent I want to get into the debate at the moment. I should at least offer some thoughts to that. So, in an anarchist society, there's you would still have that still had private industry. I'm not talking about your anarcho-communist utopia. I'm saying you still have industry. You just manage property rights privately. Now, in such a society, there would certainly be people who still have an incentive to provide national defense. A good example, just for one of many examples, would be insurance companies. I imagine that an insurance company would want to contribute something towards a defense force for a specific region that have sufficient money to do so, because if someone comes and destroys an entire town that they are meant to be insuring, then they're out a lot of money. So I think that there are a lot of people who have a vested interest in providing national defense, and perhaps several private defense forces would be able to fill that demand, right? There's a reason that the US government at the moment uses mercenary forces, right? There are massive advantages to having private. They're cheaper, more efficient.
Yes.
And so really what we're talking about, we know that mercenary forces can exist. We know that they can provide the defense, but is there the financial support for them from the market? And I think, in my opinion, there is enough private money that has a vested interest in defending its territory, right? Insurance companies is a good one. Also, potentially like private security firms. There's more private security right now than there are police. Yeah, there is a lot of money that would go into it.
And in that Fallout, example of like, that's where I think a lot of the proto government of ages past came from, was from people willing to serve the purpose. It's just like, at what point does that kind of become government? Because a lot of times, I really believe that the reason why I like libertarianism is because I like my rights. But I think where the minimum threshold of where the force comes in is because if you have one of these societies where you say, I have my rights, I have a lot of rights, and then somebody comes in willing to offer force in a vacuum and says, oh, you have rights, says who, motherfucker? That's where I start to think about it. Says who? The says who is what the government is.
There's a long economic debate to be had about whether a private legal system, as it were, right, like a system of competing defense agencies, etc., would actually produce a very libertarian set of laws. But that's, I think, a debate for another time.
And I think that's why, just to sort of wrap it up, is sort of like, I do believe that private entities could perform all of the functions that government does perform, and probably perform it better than them. It's just ultimately there's like a minimal amount of all this kind of stuff where it's like law and order, a minimum amount of like, hey, everybody's got to agree on who has what rights and where, and that's kind of what government is. Now, I think the government is a lumbering behemoth that needs to be trimmed, very much so. But
that's the fundamental
I hate the word anarchism because it implies something that I think is actually literally fucking impossible. Because private entities will fulfill these minimal functions, and perhaps in a vacuum produce a government that people don't want in their libertarian utopia out of these minimal functions, because these minimal functions have to exist.
That would depend on the economies of scale,
defense,
of course,
militias, and so forth.
Yeah, that would depend on the economies of scale, of course, right? Are these companies, the way the economics works out, is it likely that it will tend towards one giant company? At which point, yeah, you're going to get a government out of it. If it remains as several competing companies, and you can always just switch to a different one if you don't like how they're doing different things, and you can just say, I'm no longer paying for, I don't know, you'd have the various different functions of government with different agencies, but you get what I'm saying. If you can still, switch, then I think that it would produce libertarian law. If the economies of scale work such that one is likely to win out as the dominant one and control the area, then I think probably it wouldn't produce libertarian law. It would just make another government. But I think the former is more likely.
I want to ask you this one. I used to have like a 2-word answer to a lot of libertarians, because I used to say to a lot of, especially anybody who's has anarcho in front of their libertarian name. I used to be extremely derisive to these people, because I'd say, I got a 2-word answer for you. It's called robber baron. All it takes is the one person who has a monopoly on supply, a monopoly on force. They will use it, because I put that out from my thing about the corporations, where what they can do, they will do. And I think robber barons are a natural consequence of that.
I've got a video on my channel that I'd like you to watch. It's the first part of a series that I'm doing called State of Excuses. And it essentially deals with those sorts of things, like what functions of government do people think are absolutely necessary. And the first one was antitrust legislation. And in that video, I go through a lot of the history of, the robber barons, the people who were said to have been monopolists, and show how not only were they in fact not, like, for example, people always talk about US Steel or Standard Oil. Neither were even close to being monopolies. Both were being progressively outcompeted as the legislation was being passed to stop them. And there are some really good reasons to think that a free market monopoly is at least stupendously unlikely, if not impossible. The essential reason being that a monopoly would need to not only be dominating the market by providing the best service, but also dominating the market in such a way that no one else is allowed to compete with you, right? If people could still theoretically compete with you, then you can't use the dominant position you have to fuck over your consumers, because then you're not providing them the best service by definition.
I agree with you, like market by market, but what do you say about the people who buy out competition to squash them, and also cross markets? Like Google owns a hell of a lot more than just Google. Google even owns like defense firms and shit, I think, where Google researches into all shit. The way beyond
research into internet. I don't know about
what do you take if somebody has been so successful righteously in a market that they can afford to buy into other markets, or if somebody's innovating beyond them, they buy their technology and destroy it, or just take it on and do you think that like
Google just buys out their competitors
justifies the means? So, or do you think that they'll always don't you think that they could destroy innovation rather than operate within that paradigm of innovation is always working because the free market?
I think that what would happen if they attempted to just buy out all competitors and were operating in a free market, because they can't, right?
I think they could hypothetically destroy innovations in one market that would destroy their profits in another market, and therefore they would not be operating towards the greatest good.
You can always hypothetically come up with such a situation, but if you actually think about the way it would have to work, like try to think through step by step, Google trying to buy out every competitor that pops up, because keep in mind, it buys out a competitor. Okay, now 50 entrepreneurs see that and are like, shit, we don't even need to make a company to compete with Google. We just need to make a company that can make Google think that we could compete with Google, and they'll buy us out and we can make shit tons of money. So by buying out one of their competitors, they create a whole crap load more. Now, Google has a shit ton of cash, and so it's difficult to see how they could ever go bankrupt. But that's the case with a lot of people. I mean, the history is rife with companies that previously owned giant portions of an industry, got giant economies of scale, but then sort of started losing it because they they lost whatever had allowed them to provide such a positive service, right? Good examples are US Steel and Standard Oil. Because Standard Oil was actually taken out by the government to some extent. US Steel wasn't. US Steel, they failed to bring the antitrust litigation against them, but nonetheless, it still died in a hole, right? It's still the market share of US Steel still plummeted, and it's because when you get to a certain size, you're no longer efficient. Think about a boardroom, or have you worked for like a sort of a corporate company before? Like really corporate, yeah. And there will always be people who want to hold meetings when there's no fucking point. And the reason is because it seems like they're being productive, right? It's like, oh yeah, I think we need another meeting on this. And it's like, no, we fucking don't, but it seems productive to the management. And you just get into this position where a giant company is too big to keep efficient, where a small one would be. So I think that there are economies of scale where a giant company, like, they can buy out competitors, they can be more efficient. There are things that help big companies, but there's also things that help small ones and fuck over big companies, which is largely inefficiency. So I don't think that a real monopoly can form on a free market. I certainly haven't seen an example. The closest is potentially the De Beers Diamond Corporation. Even that's a bit weird how they actually managed to do it. There's a lot of involvement with various governments, but that's the best example I've ever seen. And I've looked very hard.
No, I'm pretty convinced by that argument. And then again, just as a little funny snipe to say, towards the pure anarchists who might be in the audience. Now, imagine if one of these most successful big giant corporations in your anarchist utopia decides to have their own militia and start telling people what to do, and they can afford to do so. That's why I don't like that word anarchy, because I think somebody's got to be able to tell that big giant corporation with all the money who can afford all the mercenaries, no, fuck you. And that's where I think government exists.
I like Hans Hopper's description of it. He doesn't call it anarcho-capitalism. He just calls it a private law society, right?
I would like that better myself. Yeah. Yes. Because I believe that the minimal threshold is quite possibly very, very, very low. It's just I think anarchism is bullshit.
So there are a couple more. There are a couple more responses, more questions in the chat. I'm just looking for some because, okay, so how come? So Grarlock specifically asked me to respond to his questions a little while ago, and I said I would. So I'm going to respond to Grarlock. How come so many libertarians and ANCAPs don't like open borders? I don't like open borders because I don't think that is a consistent application of property rights. Let's say that tomorrow we have perfect Ancapistan somehow, it's just all magic and it works great. Is the land that is currently owned by the government, like public roads, public parks, all the public land, is that now unowned? Because I think the answer is no. I think there are people who have homesteaded that land, who use it on a daily basis. There are some property rights with regards to public land. It is not managed perfectly by the government, but it's not unowned land. It's not out in the middle of the wilderness where no one's using it, right? And so people should have the right to refuse access onto land that they've homesteaded or land that they've been using, that sort of thing, right? So the government, therefore, saying, no, we're going to control all this land and we're going to let everyone onto it in the entire world. That is not the closest approximation of the real property rights morally, as far as I'm concerned. The closer approximation would be for the government to listen to what the people who otherwise would own the land say about what they want to be done with it and do that with it. That being said, I would like to eliminate all that public land so that immigration is no longer an issue. There are no borders because all the land is owned. There's no land for the governments to say you can come into or out of.
Fair enough. And I would even just add to it that ultimately, even in your best hope for an anarchist utopia, that there would still be a social contract that was sort of kind of letting all this stuff happen. Because I still think that
I don't like the term, but sure.
Well, because it's like the thing I said about the closed system before, is that if somebody was willing to come in and tell you all, fuck you and fuck your utopia, you now live in our totalitarian empire, and they were able to come and do it, I mean, I still think you would have to have some sort of arbitrary line somewhere where you said everybody past this point is operating under these rules, and if you don't, fuck you. And whether or not it was private militias or whatever the fuck tells them they can't cross, I'm telling you, somebody's going to try to cross the line. Whether it's the borders of your personal property or the borders of your fucking anarchist nation, somebody's going to come and try to tell you no. And so that's why I think the borders are always
ability to defend.
Because they have to be somewhere where you draw a line and says, I will fucking fight you to the death if you try to disagree with me past this point.
Right.
There's got to be something.
I suppose when I say I think there shouldn't be borders, I would say that I think that there shouldn't be state borders, right? There should be mutually agreed upon borders by a group of people.
I think societies will always go beyond a personal. Societies will always go beyond a personal homestead where you own your shit. You will always be in agreement with somebody else and their stuff, and that's where the minimal level of government is.
The agreements will always be. I just want to pause you there. There will be agreements, but a government is not an agreement. A government is not an agreement because if you don't agree to it, you don't get a choice.
Government possible is an agreement.
Okay. Well, if that counts as a government, then I'm totally in favor of that government. If it's all voluntary agreements, I wouldn't call it a government, but I'm in favor of that. So we've got a few more questions. If feminism is bad, why do you love your mom?
Because my mom isn't a feminist.
Yeah, neither is mine. So I don't. Okay. That was an interesting one. What else we got here? I can't find any more of yours, Gralok. You might want to repost them if you've got more of them. I'm scrolling down through this giant chat, and I'm looking mostly at the end part.
Because feminism is way more than just the rights of women. It comes with a lot of you can't, you won't, you shouldn't, and if you try, will hurt you. That's why I am an anti-feminist. So
right.
To the same extent where I'm a libertarian is that I believe these people are trying to fuck with me. That's in as few words as possible. I don't want to be fucked with.
That reminds me of something. I don't really do the anti-feminist videos too much anymore. Not that I don't think feminism is no longer a significant thing that we need to contend with. It is, right? It still has crazy amounts of control of various governments and institutions. But I just haven't seemed to have done some videos in a little while. I haven't been inspired to. But there is one argument that I wanted to get out there, and that is when people say that the old thing that they always say, well, just feminism just means equality. I've stopped saying...
lie.
I've stopped even saying that's a lie. It is a lie, but I've stopped saying that. My response now is, okay, fine. Feminism just means equality. So, sorry, what name do you give to the movement that is based on the work of Charles Fourier, developed through the first, second, and third waves with the various second wave, like the lesbian separatists and the patriarchy theory people, the Duluth model, that movement that defended all of that stuff and promoted all of that, and now has large controls over our universities and governments. What do you call that movement? Because that's the one I'm against, and I'm calling it feminism. If you want to call it something else, that's fine, but I'm against that movement.
There's a reason why I called it the greater amalgamation of feminism, postmodernism, Marxism, social Marxism, communism, social justice, in every permutation of it, be it like it's basically anything that is collectivist, that is producing an us versus them paradigm, which is the same thing as the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie, the blacks versus the whites, the women versus the men. It's the same fucking game every time, and that game is bullshit every time.
It is a bullshit game. I know that I've still, I think, got a significant number, not a majority, but like, you know, some like 5% or something, alt-right followers. And that's because I did some videos defending white people. And, you know, and that's always the way, right? A certain political wing will love libertarians when they are defending a group that's being attacked, but then when those libertarians stop defending that group, when it's like, okay, but I don't want to promote this group. I'm just saying you can't, you know, use your identity politics to fuck with their individual rights.
I'll tell you the
right. As soon as that happens, the alt-right or the progressives or whatever, they don't like you anymore.
I think the alt-right gets a raw deal in one aspect. Okay. Now, the alt-right has, the same as me, identified a problem. And as far as I can tell, in a lot of cases, more than you might think, I believe that the alt-right has correctly identified a problem. Whether it's, you know, the state of the black community in America, not the whole thing, but as far as like inner cities, the gangs and shit, all this shit, you know, the progressives lie about it. The liberals don't tell the truth about it. The conservatives won't even deal with it, yada, yada, yada. And they say, well, it's because they're black. I don't know if that's true, but I will tell you that they are correct that there is a problem. Now, I don't know a whole lot about the alt-right. I haven't listened to a whole lot of alt-right speakers. All I know is that the solutions I've heard them offer, I think, are bullshit. However, as to the extent that I agree with them is that I agree that they have correctly identified many problems that I don't think you need to be alt-right to have identified or provide a solution to. But they're not always wrong just because they're alt-right. That in and of itself is a collectivist idea and is bullshit.
I'm not opposed to everything the alt-right supports. In fact, in some ways, I'm opposed to nothing the alt-right supports. I just think that they should do it. Some of it isn't personally for me, and they should do it all voluntary. For example, the ethno-state, right?
And a lot of them are all about the voluntary ethno-state.
Right. Well, that's fine. If it's all voluntary, I have no issue with it. You guys go do that. That sounds great. Not for me personally. Sorry, I've got niggers and kikes who I call friends. So,
and a lot of them operate under the idea that necessarily an all-white society won't have the kind of problems that certain groups that are happen to be black dominant or whatever collective dominant. They think that those problems will go away if there's only white people.
If there's only white people, right. Like,
there's a lot
white people
of
invented communism.
White people. There's a lot of white trash. There's a lot of worthless fucking white people, and just if you have all white people, your problems will not disappear. That's all I want.
Right, just like there's a lot of black trash and Asian trash and all that sort of thing.
And there's a lot of awesome, worthwhile black people and gays, Jews, whatever the fuck.
And a lot of awesome, worthwhile white people. The point is
which is why I don't give a shit about collectivists and what they think.
Right. You know, now, on the other hand, no, I don't want to say right now, by the way, that there aren't biological differences that result in some social differences between races and stuff. There are, but there's no justification therefore. Yeah, right. Like they'll say but blacks have a lower average IQ. Yes, they do. But you know what the word average means? Right. So therefore, there are still blacks you do want in your society and whites you don't want in your society.
Exactly. And that's something that both a lot of these progressives who are not altogether at all different from the alt-right, because they think, well, all white people are fucking bad. Why? Because white people have been winning all this time. Well, that logic doesn't make any sense. Well, they were winning, unrighteously. Well, first of all, I don't agree with that. A lot of white people were winning for good reasons. A lot of white people were winning for not so good reasons. And a lot of what white people did while they were winning was wrong. But they operate under this, what do you call it? Like, it's an ultimatum type thinking. All white people are bad, just like a lot of racists will say all black people are bad. Both of those statements are not true. And anybody who says all white people are good, that statement is not true, and vice versa.
I don't think I've heard all black people are bad. I think that you will hear that if the alt-right gains more sort of authority.
Well, there's a lot of alt-right people who don't say that. They just like going like, well, I won't take the chance because of like this threshold of IQ or whatever the fuck.
I won't take the chance, right?
But I won't take the chance is usually the reason.
Take the chance is what you say when your ideas haven't gained a lot of popularity. Once they're
maybe aren't popular, that strong.
Yeah, well, no, it doesn't really matter because like the progressives will say that they hate all white people, but that's because it's sort of socially acceptable. If it became socially acceptable to say I'm skeptical of all black people, then the more extreme ones would switch to I hate all black people.
Yeah, well, that's the reason why I absolutely hate progressives, because they are everything they say they're against. They say, well, why are the Nazis bad? Because they picked somebody and said all of them are bad and fucking tried to kill them all. Well, there's so many progressives out there who openly say to you, if I had the power, if I was calling the shots, I would kill all white people. And their justification for that is because white people killed a lot of other people. And it's like, well, that's some fucking stupid, childish bullshit. And then these people are the same people who are saying, I can't play this video game. I can't say this. And not only can you not sell this thing, you also can't buy this thing if they exist. You know, Australia, I know as a gamer, they have so much trouble buying fucking video games because they're always trying to fuck with the video games. And it's not just them saying, well, you can't make this kind of video game because it's vulgar or whatever the fuck. They say you can't even buy it if it came from somewhere else. Now that's crossing a line. Fuck you. I'll buy it if I want to. And you could say you can't build that here. But if somebody says, I'll give it to you in Australia, and you say, no, you can't even receive it if somebody's trying to give it to you. No, fuck you.
Right.
That's something I'm full-blown libertarian. Don't tell me I can't receive something freely. Fuck you.
But again, you've just come back to your personal liberty. That seems to be the trigger for you to when you start like turning into a raving libertarian. You know, that's when you put up the Ron Paul 2012
that's an example where there's no logical argument.
liberty.
There's no logical argument anywhere about movies, not about music, not about video games, not about any kind of entertainment medium whatsoever, up to and including propaganda. Or I don't care if it's Moon Man fucking writing songs about kill all niggers. I don't care. I fucking have a right to listen to that. And if you don't want to buy it, don't fucking buy it. If you don't want to receive it, don't fucking receive it. Like, fuck you. Okay? It doesn't affect anybody because art is not a weapon. Art is not an act of violence. And that's something that I will be 100% balls to the wall libertarian about, is that every attempt to restrict speech and art and expression is bullshit, because there never has and likely never will be an example of being able to tell me that that is infringing on the rights of other people.
All right.
That I recognize.
So I think we should start wrapping it up soon. So we keep coming back to the idea of individual liberty, and it seems like that's sort of the impulse that liberals have, which tends to be that's what we can exploit about liberals to make them more libertarian.
Well, there's a reason why we have the same root word in our names. At least on paper, liberals are supposed to care about liberty. And me being an honest liberal was discovering more and more about what's right is more and more about what you think. And I probably will just keep on heading further that way. I don't know if I'll stop where you stop, but who knows?
All right. Well, anyway, so if there's, I'll just quickly check to see if there's any more clear questions to us in the chat. There might be there's a whole bunch of different debates going on there. Someone I think asked if I've seen a real kiwi bird, and yes, I have. They're very uncommon here in New Zealand. We just call them kiwis, by the way. I understand that you guys call kiwi fruit kiwis. We call them kiwi fruit, and we call the bird just a kiwi. Anyway, that was a different discussion. I think that's getting to the end of all of the questions. So I'm going to leave it there. All right, thanks very much, Darren, for coming on.
My pleasure.
We'll just leave it. Yeah, and if everyone did like how this sort of went, that's kind of the format I'd want to do. I'd get someone on, we'd chat about, you know, the sort of thing that pulls them towards liberty, why they have sort of transitioned away. The idea is I want to get, you know, a commie, a conservative, a progressive, just every different idea who has recently started transitioning towards libertarianism, and see what sort of things pulled them in that direction. And so if you liked that, let me know, and I will do more of these. I'll find people. And see you, Gralok. Sorry if I missed any of your questions. I noticed you had a few, but I can only scroll up too far. Yeah, so thanks for coming, everyone. Bye.
All right.